Hello there, fellow classic comic collectors. As always, I'm Scott Harris King, and in this video I wanted to do a little bit of a classic comic book club. I thought I'd show off some books, my reading material. That's why I've got this giant stack of books here. Now, these aren't collections of comic stories. They're actually books about comic books. There's a couple exceptions right at the end that I'll show you because I just thought you might find them interesting. But everything in this giant pile of books here, they're books about comics in general, about how to read comics, about making comics. They're books about the history of comics, books about specific creators, and stuff like that. So I thought I'd go through some of my library. I do love reading about comics and comics history in particular. And so I thought this might be of interest to you and maybe give you some ideas for things that you can pick up to read. So right off the top, I wanted to start with where everyone should start, really, I guess. It's Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. This is sort of a seminal key work that I reread pretty often. Every couple years I go back and reread this. Scott McCloud basically goes through, in comic form, an explanation of just the mechanics of how comics work, the visual language, what happens in your brain when you read sequential art, different techniques. It's an easy read, but it's filled with so much amazing information that it's just something that I think every comics fan should read. He's also done a couple other books which I have here as well. There's Reinventing Comics, which is a book that I wish I had taken a little more seriously when I read it. This came out quite a long time ago, and he was talking about how comics as a medium would be changing due to the internet and online comics. Again, he was talking about this a long time ago, and when I first got it, webcomics were a very small endeavor, and it seemed kind of like that what he was saying here wasn't really going to come true, but I was wrong. It did. And then he has another book called Making Comics, which goes into some of the process of making comics. I think Understanding Comics is the most important of these books. The other ones are interesting reads and definitely worth your time, but everybody should start with Understanding Comics. It's just a great, great text. So next up, we've got several history books. And these are in no particular order. They're just whatever order they came off of my shelf. So the first one here, it's Marvel Comics: The Untold Story. This came out a couple years ago. Is by Sean Howe. It's a really interesting look at the history of Marvel Comics with a lot of oral history, where he interviewed all of these different classic creators from Marvel, and he dove into all the documentation. It's a really great overview of the history of Marvel Comics. Of course, with things like this, some of the assertions in here have been disputed by other people. There's a bit of a he said thing going on with some of the anecdotes that are related in here, where one creator will tell the author X, Y, and Z, and then after the book comes out, another creator's like, that's not what happened. But it's just so much great information and really interesting stuff in here that I think any fan of Marvel should give this a read. It's a light read. It's not too dense, but it's just really, really filled with great stuff about all your favorite Marvel creators. This is a new book. I haven't read it yet. I just got this. It just came out. It's called Slugfest: Inside the Epic 50-Year Battle Between Marvel and DC. I've been hearing really good things about this. As the blurb and the title suggests, it's all about the rivalry between Marvel and DC starting in the 60s, and so, going back and forth with sort of the public shots at each other, and they're, stealing each other's talents and stuff like that. So I'm looking forward to getting into this. This is one of a couple books that I just recently got. I was originally going to include this in my unboxing video, but I lost the recording of it. So I just thought I'd show it off here. I'm looking forward to reading this. The other book I just got that I'm really looking forward to is called Implosion: An Oral History of DC Comics circa 1978. For those fans who aren't familiar with the DC Implosion, in the late 70s, I think around 76, when Jeanette Kahn came on as the new publisher at DC, or the new editor-in-chief, there was a bit of a divide there. I think Sol Harrison maybe was the president. It doesn't matter. Jeanette Kahn came over and took over, and one of her things was she wanted to increase the amount of shelf space that DC Comics were having at the newsstands. So she did this thing called the DC Explosion, where they started putting out all these new titles. And so they introduced and announced all these new titles that they started. And just after that initiative began, they had the blizzard in 1978, which is this huge, massive storm that shut down the whole East Coast. It disrupted all of the distribution. They couldn't get the comics to the newsstands, and nobody could get to the newsstands to buy comics. Result, the sales tanked, and then the people at Warner Brothers, or whatever division of Warner owned DC at the time, not knowing, really understanding anything about comics, they just saw the bottom line that sales had tanked. And so because DC was hemorrhaging money during that quarter, they ordered Jeanette Kahn to massively downsize the series, the whole line of comics. So instead of, increasing by 20 titles, after they did that, they ended up having to cancel like 40 titles, and DC had this massive shrink down. This book is all about that. I'm really looking forward to digging into this. It's a little bit more of a niche subject. Stuff like the Marvel history by Sean Howell. I think that's something that any kind of comics fan could get into. This is a very specific topic for nerds like me and for some of you, I think. So I'm really looking forward to reading this one. I do a lot of romance stuff on my channel. I'm a big collector of romance. This is a book called Love on the Rocks. It's by Michelle Nolan, and this is an absolute key, seminal, historical work for any serious romance collector. If you're thinking about getting into romance, it's very detailed. It's a little bit dense as a result, but it's absolutely comprehensive. Nobody knows as much about romance comics as Michelle Nolan, and this gives a really comprehensive overview of the romance genre in comics, all the different publishers. It does have a focus on the golden age and pre-code stuff. There's not quite as much about some of the later silver and bronze age stuff, which is actually my collecting focus, but there's just a tremendous wealth of knowledge about all the creators and the publishers and the titles and the history of the romance genre. So if you're going to get into romance, I strongly recommend this book here. And another good book about the history of romance comics is this one here. It's called Confessions, Romances, Secrets, and Temptations, Archer St. John and the St. John Romance Comics. St. John was a publisher. All of these titles, these logos, they come from different St. John Romance. They're most famous for publishing the artwork of Matt Baker, who's generally considered by fans to be the most important and greatest romance comics artist. And he worked at St. John for many years and did a lot of their covers and a lot of their interiors. This is all about the publisher, about Matt Baker, about the writer who wrote a lot of these stories. It's not just that the art's great, but they have a specific writing style that's much more nuanced and naturalistic and progressive than a lot of the other titles at the time. So it's considered to be, their books are considered to be the top of the romance genre. And so this book is all a history of St. John and its creator, Archer St. John. Here we have The Secret History of Wonder Woman by Jill Lepore. This is a really cool book that goes into a lot of detail about the creation of Wonder Woman and about the life of William Moulton Marston. I had to double check the name because, of course, he wrote under a different name and was credited under a different name for his entire writing career, and I sometimes want to call him Charles as a result. But anyway, this is all about him and the two women in his life and how they both informed not just the creation and shaping of Wonder Woman, but the writing of the series and their interesting relationship between the three of them. I have seen some Wonder Woman fans who take issue with the author here and some of her conclusions based on her research. The exact nature of the relationship between the three people in this triangle is still a little bit of a topic of debate. There was a movie that came out recently that was all about this as well, and that is more fiction. But this has a lot of great information about Wonder Woman and the creation of Wonder Woman. I strongly recommend it to any Wonder Woman fan. And in terms of, the questions about the historical accuracy or the conclusions that Lepore came to, you can Google that so you can get sort of dissenting opinions. But it's really great place to start when you're talking about the history of Wonder Woman and the people that created Wonder Woman. Okay, here's a book called Comic Wars, Marvel's Battle for Survival. This, I'm guessing, is out of print. I stumbled upon this at some random antique shop and had to buy it. This is an even more esoteric historical topic than the DC Implosion book was, because this book here is specifically about the battles for control of Marvel in the 1990s that led to the company's bankruptcy. So it has all this Wall Street stuff and very technical things with like shell companies, and talks all about Carl Icahn and Ike Perlmutter and Toy Biz, and the acquisition of Fleer and Malibu, and like all of that stuff. It goes into a bunch of detail. It's really fascinating to read. It's very dense. It's a lot about business. There's not a whole lot of stuff about the creative side of comics. It's all about the business side of Marvel and how it ended up happening, what happened. So for those of us who lived through that tumultuous era where Marvel seemed like they were on the verge of going out of business and selling off their comics, and they had to like lease out the rights to Image basically to do some of their core titles. This goes into all the details about how that came about and how they came out of it. So I found it fascinating, but it is a pretty dense read. Here is The 10-Cent Plague by David Haju, subtitled The Great Comic Book Scare and How It Changed America. This is about the creation of the Comics Code Authority and about the Senate hearings, the anti-comic movement that led to wide-scale burning and banning of comic books across the country. That's why Golden Age books are so expensive, because millions and millions and millions of them were destroyed in this crusade by people that were blaming comic books for every societal ill you can think of. The research was shoddy and sensationalistic. This goes into the details about how people were basically drumming up this fear-mongering and using comics as a scapegoat, and how it affected the people in the industry. And it goes into a lot of really interesting historical detail about the trials and the creation of the Comics Code. It talks a lot about things like race and class, and how a lot of the comics at the time were aimed at adults, but they were aimed at minorities. They were written by minorities and drawn by minorities for a minority audience. People who didn't have the money yet to get televisions, which is the new thing, and were maybe had a lower education level, so they weren't able to like read. They didn't want to read like novels, but comics like filled this gap for a lot of adults at the time, and sort of how a lot of the reaction was sort of the sort of more educated white middle class establishment rebelling sort of against this medium that they saw as sort of this low class thing that these dangerous people indulged in. So there's a lot of really interesting things. I think it's slightly over the top with its conclusions. It makes the attacks on comics out to be like this, giant thing that changed America. I think it was a much smaller thing, part of a larger thing that changed America. And so I don't think it was quite as central to what was happening in the 50s as the book necessarily makes it out to be, but it does draw some really important and interesting parallels with this and how later similar attacks played out. Like the attacks in the 80s against the late 80s against the music industry, where they ended up putting like the parental advisory labels. That was very, very similar to the attacks on comics, although played out slightly differently. And then even later in the early 2000s, there's a very similar backlash against video games, where video games were being blamed for all of society's ills and for corrupting youth in the same way that music, rap music in particular, and comic books had done previously. But in this case, it turned out very different. In video games, again, there was they did end up with a labeling system like the Comics Code, but in each case where this happened following comics, the results were less destructive to the industry. So it's a really great read. Again, I think it's a slightly over the top with its conclusions, but it's very, very good. Now we're getting into a section of stuff about individual creators. This is a great resource, the Encyclopedia of Black Comics. It's exactly what it says it is. It's got bios of all the comic creators of color, the African American creators throughout history, with bios, samples, right up to the present day. I think this is a really important book. I have a particular interest personally in the depiction of women and minorities in comics, but also female and minority creators in comics. And I'm always fascinated. You'll see that with some of the other things that I'm going to show you here. So this is a great resource. I haven't read through all of it. It's an encyclopedia. So I know there's some people that love just reading encyclopedias A to Z, and this is a lot more interesting to do that with than, say, some other encyclopedias. I haven't gotten all the way through it. Sometimes I'll pick it up and just pick a random entry and read it. But then there's other specific times where I'm looking for information on a specific creator where I'll reference this. So it's just a really cool book to have around, and I think it's a really important effort to sort of reclaim this history that's been sort of lost and overlooked. Speaking of which, that leads me to this book here. It's called JackieORMS, the first African-American woman cartoonist. JackieORMS didn't work in comic books. She worked in comic strips, but she had comic strips that were very popular starting in the 30s and running into the 1950s. They were published in black newspapers, and they feature African-American characters. And while they're sort of, her longest running one, Patty, Joe, and Ginger, was like a one-panel gag strip, but it was actually closer in a way to political cartooning. There was a lot of deep messages in it, even though it was presented as a joke strip. There was also Torchy and Heartbeats, which was a romance strip. And a lot of her work tackled a lot of issues of the day about segregation and Jim Crow and all this stuff. So it's really important. A lot of her work has been lost. I was just reading last night, actually, part of the book where it was talking about how a lot of comic strips have been lost forever because of the 1970s. A lot of libraries across the country got rid of their newspaper collections, and they basically just scanned everything into microfilm to save space, and they didn't end up scanning a lot of the comic strips. So there's a lot of her work and a lot of other similar work from other minority creators who are published in these newspapers where there's just lost because no copies of it were kept by the libraries. They're all destroyed. But it's a bit didactic. It's a bit of a dry read, but it does have tons of great examples of her work with commentary. So you can see not just the joke, but you can see what the actual subtext is and the political meaning. It's really interesting. It also has a biography of her life. So again, it's a bit of a dry read, but it's really interesting for comic historians. This is a little bit different. It's actually a graphic novel aimed at a young adult audience, but it's called Lily Renee, Escape Artist. Lily Renee is another female artist who worked in comics during the Golden Age. She did a lot of great work for Fiction House. She did a lot of covers for comics like Planet Comics, and she did a lot of interior work. She did work on the strip Senorita Rio, which was like an adventure strip with a female heroine. And this is all about her life and how she grew up in Austria and ended up having to flee the Nazi occupation, and how she got to America and actually started as a model. She got a lot of work modeling, but she really wanted to be an artist. So even though she could have pursued this modeling career, she ended up becoming a comic book artist. So this is really interesting. This is by Trina Robbins, who has done a ton of great work preserving the history of the contributions of women comic creators. She has some other books that are more historically oriented, which I don't have yet. They're on my list to track down, so I'm looking forward to tracking some of her other works down to get that. But this is a cool read. Again, it's a graphic novel. It is aimed at young adults, but I think it's a really cool read. I would love to read like a full biography of Lily Renee in text form, because I think it would be fascinating. But for now, this is a great starting point. I've got here another creator that's maybe a little better known. It's Kirby. This is by Mark Evanier. This is sort of an overview of his life and works. It also has a bunch of reproductions in here of his artwork, some on a larger scale. Many of these pages are reproduced on a larger scale than the actual comics were, because this is, as you can see, it's a huge coffee table book. It's got original art. Like here's a Jack Kirby cover design that wasn't used. It's got a bunch of really great stuff like that in here. All sorts of just fantastic like sketches, and it's just a great resource. For those who maybe aren't aware, Mark Evanier began his comics career as Kirby's assistant as a teenager in the late 60s. He went on to have a very long and successful career writing, not just comics, but more. He's better known as for writing TV shows. He's been writing TV shows since the 70s. But he also still does a lot of cool comics. I'm personally a huge fan of his. His work actually got me into comics in the first place. But he has all this firsthand personal information with Kirby, because he worked with Kirby during the 60s and early 70s, and they were very, very close throughout both of their lifetimes. So he's got all sorts of inside information and access to materials that nobody else has access to. So this is a great resource. He's working on another biography of Kirby that is less visual and is like a biography. I'm just hoping it comes out soon. He's been teasing it for quite a while, and my understanding it's almost done, but it's not out just yet. And even larger than that, so large I can barely hold it. We have here Genius Illustrated, The Life and Art of Alex Toth. Now, I personally think he is maybe the best comic book artist of all time. My personal Mount Rushmore of, not the greatest comic artist or most important, but for my personal taste, I guess, my top three would be Alex Toth, the Archie artist Harry Lucy, and then the great Darwyn Cooke, who for me is the perfect melding of both of their styles. And Toth, like nobody in the history of comics, has handled light and shadow like he did. Will Eisner is great with that too, and some other people like Darwyn Cooke. But his work, what's great about this is like the Kirby book, it reproduces in giant size some of the original pages in black and white and in color, but so you can really see like the like here's a question page that he did. You can really see the play of the light and the shadow and his use of just black. He does this thing a lot where like here's an absolute amazing page of Batman where the cape just goes up and then the logo is just inside the blackness of the cape. He does things where like the framing and everything are defined by the blacks. They're defined by the shadows. He's the best. I haven't made my way through this whole book. Partially, it's so incredibly huge and heavy that I can't hold it to read it. You have to actually put it on a coffee table, which we don't have. We don't have a coffee table. So I pull it out and I read through parts at a time and look through the pages. It's just tremendous. It's a tremendous book. I'm a huge fan of his work. So that's mostly it. I did want to have just a couple little things right at the end. These are very different, but there are a couple novels that I have that may be of interest. This is called Avengers Battle of the Earthwrecker. It's by the author named Otto Binder. This is a series of novels that Marvel put out in 1967, I think. Let me double check that. Yeah, June 1967. They put out a series of adventure novels featuring their characters. This one, as you can see, has what's basically the lineup from around Avengers 45 or so. It's got Cap's Kooky Quartet plus Hank Pym as Goliath. I can't remember if Wasp is in this. I'm guessing she is. It's been a long time since I read it. Weird thing about this is they fight this time traveler who's basically Kang, but it's not Kang. What's he called? He's called Cars. I don't know why they did that and they didn't just use Kang. In this later novel from 1977, a decade later, they just went ahead and used Kang. Now, this is by David Michelinie. It's called The Man Who Stole Tomorrow. Again, Marvel did a whole series of these novels in the late 70s. And this is considered to be one of the best ones. I thought it was good. I definitely thought it was better than Avengers Battle of the Earthwrecker. That one's kind of weird. This one reads more like a Marvel adventure. Neither of these are that easy to find. They're not that hard to find either. You should be able to get them on eBay. I don't know what they're going for these days. I got my copy of this right when eBay first happened, so I've had this since like the late 90s. But there you have it. So there's a look at part of my book collection, books about comics mostly, and I hope you've enjoyed this. Let me know in the comments below if you've read any of these books or if there's other books that I should read that I don't have in my collection that you think are good. And as always, I've got like a subscribe dongle down here or in this area. I've got a couple videos and a playlist that you can watch somewhere over here, and you can like, and there's a bell or something. So anyway, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.